They told her Americans would starve them slowly, make them beg for scraps like dogs, and laugh while they wasted away to nothing. The propaganda had been clear. The enemy was brutal, savage, without mercy. But when Margaret Vogel collapsed against the wooden fence of Camp Ruston, Louisiana, in the scorching heat of August 1945, she had not eaten in 9 days. Not because the Americans refused to feed her, because she refused to eat. She was 23 years old, a former Wehrmacht radio operator who had spent 4 years sending coded messages across Europe, and she was absolutely convinced that every meal the Americans offered was poisoned. Around her, 200 German women prisoners sat in stunned, disbelieving silence as American cooks in white aprons carried out massive trays of roasted chicken, mountains of mashed potatoes swimming in butter, and loaves of bread still steaming from the oven. The smell hit them like a physical force. Some women cried openly, some trembled so violently they could not stand. One woman, a former nurse from Berlin, fell to her knees and began to pray. Margaret watched them all with hollow, sunken eyes. Her stomach had stopped hurting days ago. It had moved past hunger into something else entirely, a cold emptiness that felt almost like peace. She would not eat. She would not give in. She would rather die with her beliefs intact than survive on bread baked by enemy hands. But what happened next would break her in ways she never could have imagined. Not with cruelty, not with violence, with kindness. If stories of human resilience and unexpected mercy move you, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from World War II. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our weekly uploads. The war ended on a Tuesday. Margaret remembered this with strange clarity because Tuesdays had always been wash days in her mother's house in Hamburg, and when the announcement came crackling over the radio that Germany had surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces, she had been folding sheets that smelled of lye soap and summer air. The normalcy of the moment had made the news feel unreal, like a dream she could not quite wake from. By Friday, she was in handcuffs. The British soldiers who arrested her were polite in a cold, efficient way that somehow made everything worse. They did not shout or strike her or drag her through the streets. They simply told her to pack one bag, no more than 10 kilograms, and to come with them. She was a Helferin, a female auxiliary of the Wehrmacht. For 4 years, she had operated radio equipment in a bunker beneath Hamburg, decoded messages that moved tanks and troops across the continent, and sent orders that may have killed thousands. Now she was a prisoner of war, and the life she had known was over. The processing center in Bremen was pure chaos. Thousands of German soldiers and military auxiliaries were being sorted, tagged, photographed, and shipped to various destinations across Europe and beyond. Margaret found herself grouped with other women, about 200 in all, ranging in age from 18 to 45. There were secretaries and nurses, telephone operators and searchlight crews, translators and clerks. Some still wore the gray-green uniforms of the Wehrmacht, faded and patched from years of war. Others had already changed into civilian clothes, hoping somehow to disappear into the masses. But there was no disappearing now. The Allies kept meticulous records. Margarete was told she was being sent to America. The word hit her like a physical blow. America. The land of jazz music and Hollywood movies, of skyscrapers and automobiles, of everything the Reich had taught her to hate and fear. She had never imagined setting foot there except perhaps as a conqueror. Now she would arrive as a prisoner. The ship that took them across the Atlantic was called the USS General W.H. Gordon, a gray military transport vessel that had carried American troops to Europe, and now carried German prisoners back the other way. Margaret had never been on a ship before. The smell of salt and diesel and too many bodies packed too close together made her sick within the first hour. The bunks were stacked 4 high in the hold, and the women slept pressed against each other like sardines in a tin, their bodies rocking with every wave. The engines hummed day and night, a constant vibration that worked its way into her bones and made sleep nearly impossible. On the 3rd day at sea, American sailors brought food down to the hold. They carried metal trays loaded with white bread, real butter in little paper packets, and something they called spam, a pink processed meat in rectangular tins. Margaret stared at the food in disbelief. In the final months of the war, she had been living on watery cabbage soup and bread made partly from sawdust. The bread before her now was soft, white, untouched by the desperation of a starving nation. Around her, some women fell upon the food eagerly, shoving bread into their mouths as if afraid it would be snatched away at any moment. Their eyes were wild with hunger, their hands trembling. Others, like Margarete, held back, watching with suspicion. An older woman named Ilse, a former nurse from Berlin who had seen terrible things in military hospitals, leaned close and whispered in Margaret's ear, "Do not eat it. It could be drugged. They want to make us weak and confused before the interrogations begin." Margaret nodded. The warning made sense. Why else would the enemy feed them so well? There had to be a reason behind such generosity. There was always a reason. She pushed her tray away and watched the others eat, her stomach cramping with hunger, but her mind fixed on survival. The ship docked in New Orleans on a humid August morning that felt like stepping into a steam bath. The air hit Margaret like a wet blanket the moment she climbed up from the hold. It was thick, hot, suffocating, heavy with moisture and strange smells she could not identify. She had never felt heat like this in her life. In Hamburg, summers were mild and breezy, touched by the cool winds of the North Sea. This Louisiana heat was something else entirely. It pressed down on her chest with physical weight and made every breath feel like work. American soldiers lined the dock in their crisp khaki uniforms, rifles slung casually over their shoulders. Margaret searched their faces for the hatred and cruelty she had been warned about, the savage bloodlust that propaganda posters had promised. But most of them looked bored, some looked curious, studying the German women with the same interest they might show zoo animals. One young soldier, barely older than 18 with a face full of freckles, actually smiled at her as she walked past. She looked away quickly, confused and unsettled by the simple human gesture. Buses waited in a long row along the pier, their engines idling, heat shimmering off their metal roofs. The women were loaded on, counted, and counted again. An American officer with a clipboard walked slowly down the aisle, checking names against a master list, asking questions through an interpreter. When he reached Margaret, he paused and studied her face. Vogel Margarete, radio operator, 3rd Signal Battalion, Hamburg. He looked up from his papers. You speak English? She understood him perfectly. She had learned English in school, before the war made such things impossible. But speaking the enemy's language felt like betrayal, like admitting defeat. So she said nothing, just stared at him with blank eyes until he shrugged and moved on to the next prisoner. The bus lurched forward, and Margaret pressed her face against the window like a child. Outside, America unfolded before her eyes like scenes from a dream. Green fields stretched to the horizon, impossibly lush after years of bombed-out European landscapes. White farmhouses stood untouched by war, their paint fresh, their windows whole. Cars gleamed in the sunlight. So many cars, more than she had seen in years. Children waved from front porches as the buses passed. A woman in a bright red dress hung laundry on a line, humming to herself. Wait. The fear lingered, coiling in her stomach with every mile. But the land looked so peaceful, so untouched, so completely different from the ruins she had left behind. Camp Ruston sat on flat Louisiana ground, surrounded by tall pine trees and fields of cotton that stretched white as snow to the horizon. The wooden barracks were simple, but surprisingly well-maintained, painted white with neat green trim. Guard towers rose at each corner of the compound, but the guards inside them looked relaxed, almost bored. Some were reading newspapers. Others sat with their feet up, watching clouds drift across the enormous sky. The barbed wire fence that surrounded the camp looked almost decorative compared to the brutal fortifications Margaret had seen in Germany. The women were unloaded from the buses and assembled in a loose formation on the dusty parade ground. An American officer, a woman with short gray hair and a stern but not unkind face, stepped forward to address them. Her name was Captain Dorothy Hayes, they were told through an interpreter, and she would be their camp administrator for the duration of their internment. You are now prisoners of war under the protection of the United States Army and the Geneva Convention, the interpreter said, translating Captain Hayes's words with careful precision. You will be treated with dignity and respect at all times. You will work, and you will be paid fair wages for your work. You will receive 3 meals a day, medical care when needed, and mail privileges to write home to your families. You will be housed in clean barracks and provided with all basic necessities. Do you have any questions? The women stood in stunned silence. 3 meals a day? In the final desperate months of the war, Margaret had counted herself lucky to eat once. Medical care? She had watched friends die of simple infections that could have been cured with basic antibiotics that no longer existed in Germany, mail privileges, clean barracks, paid wages. This had to be some kind of elaborate trick, a psychological game designed to break them before the real punishment began. The first stop in their processing was the delousing station, a long brick building at the edge of the compound. The women were told to remove their clothes, place them in numbered bags for fumigation, and proceed to the showers. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. This was where the humiliation would finally begin. She had heard the stories, terrible whispered stories about what happened to women in enemy hands. She steeled herself for the worst. But instead of leering male guards or cruel laughter, she found female nurses in spotless white uniforms who spoke softly and handed out cotton robes with quiet efficiency. The showers were separated by individual curtains, offering privacy she had not expected. The water, when she finally stepped beneath the spray, was hot, really, genuinely hot, and real soap was pressed into her trembling hands. Not the gritty gray substitute soap they had used in Germany, made from who knows what. This was real soap, white and thick and heavy, smelling faintly of flowers. Margarete stood frozen under the stream of water, unable to move, unable to process what was happening. She had not felt hot water on her skin in over a year. In the final months of the Reich, there had been no fuel left for heating water, no soap left in the stores, no clean clothes to change into. She had grown so accustomed to the constant itch of lice, the grime that never fully washed away, the smell of her own unwashed body, that she had almost forgotten what clean felt like. Now, standing in an enemy's camp, she was cleaner than she had been in years. When she emerged from the showers, a nurse handed her a fresh towel, soft and white and smelling of starch, and a complete set of clean clothes. Simple gray work pants and a white cotton blouse, but new, unworn, without a single patch or mend. Margaret dressed in mechanical silence, her mind racing, trying to make sense of this strange new reality. Why are they doing this? What do they really want from us? What is the price for all this kindness? A young woman named Brigitte, a former telephone operator from Frankfurt with bright blue eyes and a nervous laugh, touched Margaret's arm as they walked out of the deluging station. "My God," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "The soap. Did you smell it? It smelled like roses. I had forgotten what roses smelled like." Margaret said nothing. She did not trust roses that came from the enemy. There had to be thorns hidden somewhere. The mess hall was a long, low building with rows of sturdy wooden tables and benches that could seat hundreds. Windows lined both walls, letting in the golden afternoon light and the thick Louisiana heat. But it was the smell that stopped Margaret in her tracks the moment she stepped through the door. Meat cooking, bread baking, something sweet and warm. Her stomach cramped so violently she nearly doubled over, reminding her with brutal clarity that she had not eaten in 3 days. But she had made her decision on the ship, somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. She would not eat, not until she understood what the Americans really wanted. Food was a weapon, as surely as guns and bombs, and she would not allow them to use it against her. She would watch and wait and keep her guard up. Let the others fall into the trap. She would remain strong. The women lined up at a long counter where American cooks, large cheerful men in white aprons and tall chef's hats, scooped food onto metal trays with generous hands. Margaret watched in growing disbelief as the women ahead of her received their portions. Mashed potatoes, fluffy and white, with rivers of melted butter running down the sides. Green beans cooked with bits of bacon. Thick slices of roasted chicken with crispy golden skin. Soft dinner rolls that steamed when broken open. And for dessert, a square of yellow cake with thick chocolate frosting. One woman, a former searchlight operator named Greta, who had spent the last year of the war living on rutabaga soup and sawdust bread, burst into tears the moment the loaded tray was placed in her hands. Great heaving sobs shook her thin body as she stood paralyzed in the serving line, staring at more food than she had seen in 2 years. "I cannot," she wept. "I cannot believe this. 2 years. 2 years of hunger, and now this." The cook, a heavy-set man with kind brown eyes and a gentle manner, did not understand her German words, but he understood her tears perfectly well. Without a word, he reached across the counter and added an extra roll to her tray, then gave her an awkward but genuine pat on the shoulder. "It's okay, honey," he said in his slow southern drawl. "Eat up. There's plenty more where that came from." When Margaret reached the counter, she shook her head firmly. "No," she said in English, one of the few words she allowed herself to speak to these people. "No food." The cook frowned in confusion. "No food? You don't want nothing to eat?" He gestured at the trays of food behind him, steam rising into the air. "We got plenty. Chicken, potatoes, fresh bread. Best meal you're gonna get." She shook her head again, more firmly this time, and walked away with empty hands, her stomach screaming in protest with every step. At a table near the window she sat alone and watched the others eat. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite, closing their eyes as they chewed. Others shoveled food into their mouths with both hands, as if terrified it might disappear at any moment. A few, like Margaret, sat with nothing, their suspicion stronger than their hunger, their fear stronger than their need. Brigitte slid onto the bench across from her tray loaded with food. She looked at Margaret with concerned eyes. "You must eat something. You look like a ghost already. You cannot survive on suspicion alone." "I would rather be a ghost than a fool," Margaret replied, her voice flat and cold. "This is all a trick, Brigitte, a game they are playing. They will make us comfortable, make us trust them, and then they will turn on us when our guard is down. Wait and see. It always happens. There is always a price." Brigitte looked at the golden chicken on her tray, then back at Margaret's hollow face. For a moment, doubt flickered in her bright blue eyes, and her fork hovered uncertainly over the plate. Then she picked up the chicken and took a large bite, grease running down her chin. "If this is a trick," she said between chews, "at least I will die with a full stomach." That is more than I could say in Frankfurt. The barracks were divided into individual rooms, each containing 8 wooden bunk beds arranged in neat rows. Margaret was assigned to room 12, in the third barracks from the gate, with 7 other women of similar age and background. The bunks had real mattresses, not the straw-filled pallets she had grown used to in Germany. Each woman received 2 wool blankets, a pillow with an actual pillowcase, and a small wooden locker for personal belongings. There were hooks on the walls for hanging clothes and a shared bathroom at the end of the hall with running water, flush toilets, and mirrors above the sinks. That night, as the other women settled into their bunks, marveling at the softness of the mattresses and the warmth of the blankets, Margaret sat on the edge of hers and stared at the whitewashed wall. Her stomach had stopped growling hours ago. It had moved past the sharp pains of hunger into a dull, constant ache that seemed to have become part of her body. She knew she was hurting herself. She knew that every day without food brought her closer to collapse. She did not care. The principle mattered more than survival. A woman named Ursula, who had the bunk directly above Margaret's, leaned down from her mattress. She was older than most of the others, perhaps 40, with streaks of gray in her dark hair and deep lines around her eyes that spoke of things she had seen and could never forget. Before the war, she had been a nurse in Munich. During the war, she had worked in a military hospital near the Eastern Front, treating wounds that no medical training could have prepared her for. "How long do you plan to starve yourself?" Ursula asked quietly, so the others could not hear. Her voice held no judgment, only weary curiosity. "As long as it takes to understand what they really want from us." Ursula was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke again, her voice soft with a pain that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. "What if they want nothing? What if this is simply how they do things? What if this is what it looks like when a country wins a war and can afford to be generous?" Margaret shook her head stubbornly. "No one does something for nothing. There is always a price. There is always an angle." "Perhaps the price has already been paid," Ursula said softly, almost to herself. "Perhaps this is what losing a war looks like for the losers. Not torture, not death camps, just this. Being fed and clothed by the people you were told to hate while your own country lies in ruins." Margaret lay down and turned her face to the wall, ending the conversation. Outside, the Louisiana night came alive with the sound of crickets and frogs, a chorus of strange sounds so different from the silence of German evenings. She closed her eyes and tried to remember the sound of her mother's voice, her father's quiet laugh, the church bells that rang every Sunday morning in Hamburg. But the memories were already fading, being replaced by new sensations she did not want: the smell of roasted chicken, the weight of real soap in her hands, the soft cotton of clean clothes against her skin. She had expected the enemy to break her with cruelty. She had not expected them to break her with kindness, and that somehow was far more terrifying. The days at Camp Ruston settled quickly into a strict but not unpleasant routine. Wake-up bell at 6 in the morning, sharp and clear in the humid Louisiana air, breakfast at 7, work assignments distributed at 8, lunch at noon, a brief respite from the heat. More work until 5 in the afternoon, dinner at 6, free time until lights out at 10. The rhythm was military, familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. It reminded Margaret of her years in the Wehrmacht, when routine had been the scaffolding that held her days together. Margareta was assigned to the camp laundry, a large, steaming building on the east side of the compound where 30 women worked in shifts, washing, drying, pressing, and folding the uniforms of the American soldiers stationed at the camp. It was hard work. The industrial washing machines were loud enough to leave ears ringing. The air was thick with steam and the smell of soap and bleach, and the loads of laundry seemed never-ending. Margaret's hands cracked from the constant moisture, and her back ached from hours of standing. But at the end of each week, something remarkable happened. A camp administrator came to the laundry with a stack of small envelopes, and each woman received her wages, crisp slips of camp script, printed on special paper that could be spent at the camp canteen. Margaret stared at her first payment in disbelief. She was being paid for her work as a prisoner. In 4 years of service to the Wehrmacht, she had never received a single Reichsmark beyond her basic rations. She had served, risked her life, watched friends die, and received nothing but propaganda and empty promises in return. Now, as a prisoner of the enemy, she was earning more than she ever had as a soldier of the Reich. The contradiction gnawed at her constantly, a splinter in her mind that she could not remove. The canteen was a small wooden building near the mess hall, painted the same white and green as everything else in the camp. Inside, wooden shelves displayed goods that Margaret had not seen in years, goods she had almost forgotten existed. Chocolate bars in bright wrappers, packs of cigarettes, American brands with exotic names, bars of soap in different colors and scents, tubes of toothpaste with mint flavoring, combs and hairbrushes and small mirrors, writing paper and envelopes for letters home, and in a glass case near the register, impossible and dreamlike, tubes of lipstick, red and pink and coral, colors that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The women gathered around the shelves like pilgrims approaching a holy shrine. Their hands trembled as they reached for items they had not touched in years. Some made practical purchases: soap, toothbrushes, writing paper to send word home to families who did not know if they were alive or dead. Others splurged on small luxuries, holding chocolate bars to their noses just to breathe in the sweet smell, turning lipstick tubes over and over in their hands as if they were precious jewels. A girl named Elsa, barely 19 years old with a face still holding the softness of childhood, bought a tube of pink lipstick with her entire first week's wages. She applied it right there in the canteen, staring at herself in a small hand mirror with an expression of wonder and grief so intense that several women had to look away. "I look like myself again," she whispered, her voice breaking. I had forgotten what I looked like. I had forgotten that I could look like a woman instead of a skeleton. Margarete stood in the corner of the canteen, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her wages unspent in her pocket. 6 days had now passed since her arrival, 6 days without a single bite of food. The camp doctor, a gentle older man with silver hair and worried eyes, had called her into his office twice already, warning her that she was dangerously underweight, that her body was beginning to consume its own muscle tissue to survive. She had nodded politely, thanked him for his concern, and returned to her bunk to lie staring at the ceiling. Letters from home began arriving in the second week of captivity. They came in bundles, carried by American mail clerks who could not read the German words inside, but handled the envelopes with surprising care. Margaret received 3 letters on the same gray afternoon, one from her mother, one from her younger sister Helga, and one from a former colleague who had somehow survived the bombing of Hamburg. She read her mother's letter first, sitting alone on her bunk as the afternoon light faded outside the window. The handwriting was shakier than she remembered, weaker, the letters formed with visible effort. "My dearest Margaret," her mother wrote, "we received word through the Red Cross that you are alive and in America. I thank God every hour of every day for this news. I had given up hope. I had prepared myself to never see you again. Things are very difficult here. The house was badly damaged in the bombing last March. The upper floors are gone entirely. We live now in 2 rooms on the ground floor, your father and I and Helga and her 2 children. The children cry at night from hunger. There is so little food. We eat potatoes when we can find them, and sometimes cabbage or turnips. Meat is only a memory. Bread costs more than we can pay. Your father's health is failing. He coughs all through the night and cannot work. The doctors say it is his lungs, damaged from the smoke when the factory burned. We have no medicine to give him. We can only pray, but we are alive. That is what matters now. Please write and tell us you are well. Tell us about America. Is it as terrible as we were told? Are they treating you badly? I pray for you every night, my darling daughter. Your loving mother." Margarete folded the letter carefully, precisely, and placed it in her locker with hands that would not stop trembling. Then she walked slowly to the mess hall, where the evening meal was being prepared. The smell of roasting pork drifted through the open doors. Fresh bread was being sliced on long cutting boards. Bowls of mashed potatoes and gravy waited on the serving counter. A cook was arranging slices of apple pie on plates for dessert. More food in one meal than her family would see in a week. More food than her niece and nephew could imagine in their hunger dreams. She stood in the doorway of the mess hall, watching the other women line up with their metal trays. Some of them had received letters too. Some were crying quietly as they ate, tears dropping into their mashed potatoes. Others laughed and chatted, sharing news from home, grateful for any word at all. But all of them ate. All of them accepted the abundant food on the enemy's table, while their own families starved on the other side of an ocean. How could they eat? How could they smile and laugh? Did they not feel the shame burning in their throats? Did they not see the obscenity of it all? That night, Margaret sat at the small desk in her barracks and wrote a letter to her mother. She described the camp in careful, measured words: the clean barracks, the regular work schedule, the guards who did not shout or strike. She mentioned the weather, the strange Louisiana heat, the sound of crickets at night, but she did not mention the food. She could not find the words. How could she tell her starving mother that she was surrounded by abundance? How could she describe the roasted pork and apple pie while children cried from hunger in the ruins of Hamburg? On the 7th day, Captain Dorothy Hayes came to see her personally. The American woman was tall and thin, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything, and a manner that was stern but not without warmth. She sat down on the bunk next to Margaret and spoke through an interpreter, a German-American private from Wisconsin, whose parents had emigrated from Bavaria before the First War. "The doctor tells me you have not eaten in 7 days, Captain Hayes said, her voice matter-of-fact but concerned. He tells me you are approaching a critical point. This concerns me greatly." "I am not hungry," Margaret lied. Her stomach was a constant ache now, a hollowness that had become part of her identity. "You are starving yourself to death? Deliberately. Why?" Margaret was silent for a long moment, considering her words carefully. Then, for the first time since arriving in America, she spoke in halting but clear English. "I do not trust. You give food, you give soap, you give money for work. Why? Why do you do this? What do you want from us?" Captain Hayes studied her for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then, to Margaret's surprise, she smiled. Not a mocking smile or a superior smile, but something sad and understanding, as if she recognized something familiar in Margaret's suspicion. "I want you to live," she said simply. "That is what I want. That is all I want. The war is over, Miss Vogel. You are not my enemy anymore. You are a young woman who has been through hell, and my job is to make sure you survive it and return home to your family in one piece. But why? Margaret pressed, genuinely confused. Why do you care what happens to us? We were your enemies. We killed your soldiers. Captain Hayes leaned forward, her eyes intense. Because that is who we are. Because that is what separates us from what we fought against. If we treat our prisoners the way the Nazis treated theirs, then we become the very thing we spent 4 years destroying. I refuse to let that happen. Not on my watch. She stood up and smoothed her uniform with practiced hands. I will not force you to eat, Miss Vogel. That is your choice, and I respect it, even if I think it is a terrible one. But I will tell you this. Every day you refuse food, you give the Nazis one more victory. They told you we were monsters. They told you we would torture and degrade you. Prove them wrong by living. She left without another word. Margaret sat alone on her bunk, staring at the floor, the captain's words echoing in her mind like the toll of a distant bell. Prove them wrong by living. On the 8th day, a new guard was assigned to the laundry. His name was Private James Wilson, a farm boy from Kansas with red hair, freckles, and an easy smile that seemed to come naturally to his face. He was 20 years old, the same age Margaret's younger brother Klaus had been when he died in the snow somewhere on the Eastern Front 2 winters ago. Looking at Private Wilson was like looking at a ghost, a version of Klaus who had grown up in peace instead of war. Private Wilson did not speak German, and Margaret continued to pretend she did not speak English. But he smiled at her every morning when she arrived for her shift, and every afternoon when she left. On the 2nd day, he brought her a cup of water without being asked, simply noticing that she looked thirsty and acting on simple human kindness. On the 3rd day, he showed her a photograph of his family, his parents and 2 sisters, and their spotted dog, and pointed to each one, speaking their names slowly and carefully, as if she were a child just learning to read. Mom, Dad, Sarah, Emily. And this here is Buster. He grinned at the dog in the photo. Buster's the smartest one in the family. Don't tell my sisters I said that. Despite herself, despite everything, Margaret smiled. It was a small smile, barely a twitch at the corners of her mouth, but it was the first time she had smiled since leaving Germany. And in that moment, something inside her cracked open, just a little, just enough to let in a sliver of light. The 9th day began like all the others. The wake-up bell at 6, the shuffle of feet as women rose from their bunks, the walk to the washroom, the splash of water on faces, the whispered conversations in German. But something was different. Margaret was weaker than she had ever been in her life. Standing in line for roll call, she felt the world spin and tilt around her like a ship in a storm. The Louisiana sun beat down with its usual merciless intensity, and her legs trembled beneath her weight like the legs of a newborn colt. Ursula, standing beside her as always, grabbed her arm with strong nurse's hands. You need to sit down, right now, before you fall. I am fine, Margaret whispered, but her voice came out thin and reedy, barely audible. You are dying. Do you understand that? You are killing yourself. Margaret had tried to shake her head, but the motion made everything blur and swim. She blinked, trying desperately to focus, but the faces around her had become smears of color without definition. Someone was calling her name. Someone was touching her shoulder, and then the ground rushed up to meet her with terrifying speed, and everything went black. She woke in the camp infirmary. The room was white and clean with rows of empty beds and windows that let in the soft afternoon light. A nurse sat beside her bed, a young American woman with blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her face showed concern but not alarm. You're awake, the nurse said. Her German was heavily accented but understandable, learned perhaps from immigrant grandparents. You gave everyone quite a scare. The doctor wasn't sure you were going to wake up. Margaret tried to sit up, but her body refused to cooperate. She was too weak, too depleted. 9 days without food had reduced her to this, a skeleton in a hospital bed, unable to lift her own head from the pillow. Her arms felt like they belonged to someone else. The doctor wants to put you on intravenous feeding, the nurse continued gently. Glucose and nutrients directly into your bloodstream, but he would prefer if you ate on your own. It would be better for your recovery. Will you eat? Margaret closed her eyes. Behind her eyelids, she saw her mother eating potato soup in a bombed-out house. She saw her father coughing blood into a handkerchief. She saw her brother Klaus, frozen forever at 20, lying somewhere unmarked in Russian snow. She saw everything she had believed, everything she had been taught, everything she had accepted without question for 23 years of life. All lies, every word of it. Lies built on lies, collapsing into ruins. The nurse was still waiting, patient and kind. Margaret opened her eyes and looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time seeing not an enemy, but a young woman doing her job. Trying to help. Yes, she whispered, the words scraping out of her dry throat like sand over stone. I will eat. They brought her broth first. It was thin and warm and salty, the simplest thing they could offer a body that had forgotten how to digest. It was also the most delicious thing Margaret had ever tasted in her life. Each careful sip spread warmth through her body, waking parts of her that had gone numb with hunger. Then came soft bread, torn into tiny pieces to ease the shock to her shrunken stomach. Then a few spoonfuls of mashed potatoes, smooth and buttery. Finally, a cup of sweet tea with sugar and milk, a luxury beyond anything she could have imagined. By the time she finished, tears were streaming down her hollow cheeks, and she could not have said exactly why. Relief, perhaps, at finally giving in. Shame at having held out so long for nothing. Grief for the person she had been, the beliefs she had clung to, the walls she had built around her heart. The nurse sat beside her through it all, saying nothing, simply holding her hand. That evening, Ursula came to visit the infirmary. She sat on the edge of Margaret's bed, her experienced nurse's eyes taking in the IV drip, the color slowly returning to Margaret's cheeks, the empty bowl of broth on the bedside table. "You ate?" she said. It was not a question. Margaret nodded, unable to speak. "How do you feel?" Margaret thought for a long time before answering, searching for words that could capture the storm inside her. "Lost," she finally said. "Everything I believed, everything I was taught since I was a child, it was wrong. The Americans are not monsters. They are just people. Some kind, some indifferent, some probably cruel, but just people. And if they are just people, then what were we fighting for? What did my brother die for? What was any of it for?" Ursula was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant with memories of her own. Then she spoke, her voice heavy with the weight of truth she had carried alone for too long. "I asked myself the same question when I saw what they did in the camps, the other camps, the death camps. I was a nurse, Margaret. I treated German soldiers who came back from the East with stories so terrible I refused to believe them. I told myself it was propaganda, exaggeration, lies from the enemy designed to demoralize us. But then the war ended, and the photographs came out, and I saw—" She stopped, unable to continue, tears rolling silently down her weathered cheeks. Margaret reached out and took her hand. They sat together in silence as the sun set over Camp Ruston, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, two women carrying the weight of a nation's sins on their shoulders. In the weeks that followed, Margaret slowly rebuilt her strength. She ate 3 meals a day, starting with soft foods, and gradually working up to the full portions that the other women received. Her body responded with almost desperate gratitude, absorbing every calorie, rebuilding muscle and fat, restoring the color to her skin. She gained weight steadily, her cheekbones receding, her eyes losing their haunted, hollow look. When she returned to work in the laundry, Private Wilson greeted her with an extra-wide smile. "You look better," he said, speaking slowly so she could understand, even as she pretended not to. "A lot better. I was worried about you for a while there." "Thank you," she replied, and it was the first time she had spoken English to an American willingly, without the shield of pretense. The word felt strange on her tongue, but also somehow right. One day in early September, the women were taken into the nearby town of Ruston for a special work detail. A church had been damaged in a recent storm, and volunteers were needed to help with the cleanup. The women rode in the back of an open truck, watching the Louisiana countryside roll past, marveling at the green fields and white houses and complete absence of bomb craters. The church was a simple white wooden building with a tall steeple and stained glass windows that had somehow survived the storm, intact. Inside, pews had been overturned by the wind, and debris littered the floor. The women set to work immediately, sweeping and scrubbing, righting the heavy wooden benches, picking up hymnals that had been scattered everywhere. At noon, the church ladies brought lunch. They set up folding tables on the lawn and spread out a feast. Fried chicken and biscuits, coleslaw and potato salad, pitchers of sweet tea and lemonade, and for dessert, slices of pecan pie with whipped cream. The German women stood at a respectful distance, uncertain whether they were welcome at this table, uncertain of the rules in this strange new world. An elderly woman in a flowered dress walked over to them. She was small and stooped with age, her hair white as snow, her hands gnarled with arthritis. She looked at Margaret with eyes that held no hatred, only a kind of weary compassion. "Essen Sie," she said in German. "Eat. You are hungry, and there is plenty." Margaret stared at her in shock. "You speak German?" The old woman nodded. "My grandmother came from Bavaria in 1880. I learned from her when I was a child, sitting on her knee in this very town." She smiled, her face creasing into 1,000 wrinkles. "The war is over, child. Whatever happened, whatever you did, whatever you believed, it is finished now. Let us eat together like human beings." Margaret looked at the table laden with food, at the American women who had prepared it with their own hands, at the church where they had come together to help strangers they had every reason to hate. Then she looked at the old woman, at her kind eyes and weathered face, at the Bavarian lilt still audible in her German after all these decades. And for the first time since the war began, something inside Margaret broke open, not with pain, but with something that felt impossibly like hope. She sat down at the table, she filled her plate with food, and when the old woman patted her hand and said, "There now, that is better, yes?" Margaret began to cry, not from grief or shame, but from the unbearable, overwhelming weight of unexpected grace. The turning point came on a Sunday afternoon in late September, when summer was finally loosening its grip and the first cool breezes began to drift down from the north. The camp had organized a small gathering, a picnic of sorts, to mark the end of the hot season. American guards and German prisoners mingled together on the grass, eating hamburgers and drinking lemonade, the boundaries between them blurred for one strange afternoon. Someone had brought a portable radio, and music drifted across the lawn. Jazz and swing, the sounds of America, music that had been banned in Germany for years. Margaret sat on a blanket with Brigitte and Ursula and several other women from her barracks. They watched the Americans dance, guards and nurses and cooks spinning and laughing in the afternoon light, their movements loose and joyful in ways that seemed foreign and somehow dangerous. It was strange and beautiful and deeply unsettling, all at the same time. Private Wilson appeared at the edge of their blanket, his face flushed red with embarrassment. He shuffled his feet and looked at the ground for a long moment before finally speaking. Would you if you wanted to, would you like to dance?" The question was directed at Margaret. She felt the eyes of every woman on the blanket turn toward her. She should have said no. She was a prisoner, and he was a guard. The war had been over for only a few months, the wounds still fresh and bleeding. She had spent years learning to hate everything he represented. But something in his eyes, the nervousness, the hope, the simple human longing for connection, made her pause. He reminded her so much of Klaus, the same age, the same open face, the same awkward earnestness. If Klaus had survived, if he had grown up in a world without war, might he have asked some girl to dance at a picnic, with that same nervous shuffle of his feet? "I do not know American dancing," she said finally. His face lit up with a grin. "That's okay. I'll teach you. It's easy, really. Just follow my lead." And so Margaret Vogel, former radio operator of the 3rd Signal Battalion of the Wehrmacht, took the hand of Private James Wilson, farm boy from Kansas, and learned to dance to American jazz on a Louisiana afternoon. They stumbled and laughed and stepped on each other's feet. The other women watched with wide eyes. Some of the guards looked disapproving, but Captain Hayes, standing at the edge of the lawn with a cup of lemonade, only smiled and looked away. When the song ended, Margaret stepped back, breathing hard. Her heart was pounding, not from the exercise, but from something else entirely. Something terrifying, something wonderful. "Thank you," she said. "That was nice." Private Wilson beamed like the sun had just risen on his face. "Anytime, really, anytime you want." That night, lying in her bunk, Margaret stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of what had happened. She had danced with an American soldier. She had laughed with him. She had looked into his eyes and seen not an enemy, but a boy who missed his family and his dog and his home, just as she missed hers. Somewhere along the way, without her permission, she had stopped seeing them as the enemy and started seeing them as people. If the enemy is human, then what does that make us? What does that make everything we did in their name? The question haunted her. It would haunt her for the rest of her life. But in that moment, lying in the darkness of a prisoner of war camp 10,000 miles from the ruins of her homeland, Margaret realized that the answer did not matter as much as she had thought. What mattered was that she was alive. What mattered was that she had been shown mercy when she expected cruelty. What mattered was that, against all odds, she had learned to hope again. The announcement came in early November, as the leaves on the Louisiana trees turned gold and red and drifted to the ground. The women were to be repatriated to Germany. Ships were being prepared at the port of New Orleans. They would leave before Christmas. The news spread through the camp like wildfire, passed from bunk to bunk, barracks to barracks, woman to woman. Some wept with joy at the thought of seeing their families again, of walking through the streets of their hometowns, of hearing German spoken all around them. Others wept with fear, terrified of what awaited them in the ruins of their defeated nation. Margaret felt both emotions tangled together in her chest, pulling her in opposite directions. The pull of home and the dread of return, inseparable and equally strong. "What will we tell them?" Brigitte asked one night, sitting cross-legged on Margaret's bunk as the rain drummed against the barracks roof. "Our families, I mean. What will we say about this place?" "The truth," Margaret said after a long pause. "We will tell them the truth. And if they do not believe us? If they think we are lying, or worse, that we were collaborators?" Margaret had no answer. How could she explain to her starving mother that she had gained weight in captivity? How could she describe the chocolate bars and lipstick and dancing on the lawn? How could she make anyone understand that the enemy had treated her with more dignity than her own government ever had? The night before the departure, Margaret found herself standing alone near the perimeter fence, staring up at the stars. The Louisiana sky was clear and cold, the stars brighter and more numerous than she had ever seen them. She was so absorbed in the sight that she did not hear the footsteps until Private Wilson was standing beside her. "I wanted to say goodbye," he said, his voice awkward and uncertain. "And I wanted to give you this, something to remember." He held out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Margarete took it with trembling hands and opened it carefully. Inside was a bar of Hershey's chocolate, a photograph of Private Wilson and his family standing on the porch of their farmhouse, and a letter written in careful, childish German. He had clearly spent hours with a dictionary, looking up each word. The letter said simply, "I hope you find peace in your life. You deserve it. Your friend, James." She looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears she could not stop. He smiled his farm boy smile and shrugged, embarrassed by his own sentimentality. "I know it's not much, but I wanted you to have something, not to remember all of us, just the good parts." "I will remember," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I will remember everything, the good and the bad, but especially the good." The ship that carried them back to Germany was crowded and cold, a sharp contrast to the heat of Louisiana, but Margaret did not mind. She stood on the deck as the American coast faded into the gray Atlantic mist, the chocolate bar still in her pocket, the photograph pressed against her heart. Germany, when they finally arrived, was everything she had feared, and worse. Hamburg was a skeleton of a city, entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, streets that she had walked as a child now unrecognizable wastelands of brick and ash. Children begged on every corner, their faces thin and gray with malnutrition. Her parents' house was barely standing, held together with boards and prayers. Her mother had aged 20 years. And her father, her strong, quiet father, who had never been sick a day in his life, was gone. He had passed 2 weeks before her ship docked, slipping away in his sleep, never knowing that his daughter was coming home. Margaret did not tell them about the food at first. She did not tell them about the chocolate or the dancing or the kind old woman at the church. She simply held her mother and wept and let the silence fill the spaces where words could not go. But years later, when the wounds had healed and the cities had been rebuilt, and life had returned to something like normal, Margaret told her daughter the story. She told her about the ship across the Atlantic and the bus through Louisiana. She told her about the 9 days without food and the broth that tasted like salvation. She told her about Captain Hayes and Private Wilson and the old woman from Bavaria who had offered grace to an enemy. "Why did you not eat?" her daughter asked, a young woman now with her mother's eyes and her grandmother's stubborn chin. "Because I was afraid," Margaret said, her voice steady with the wisdom of years. "I was afraid that if I accepted their kindness, it would mean everything I had believed was wrong, and I was right to be afraid, because it was wrong, all of it. Everything we were told, everything we believed, it was built on lies. But the Americans, they showed me something I was not prepared to see. They showed me that being wrong is not the end of the world. They showed me that enemies can become friends, that hatred can become understanding, that kindness is stronger than any weapon ever made." She smiled, her eyes bright with memory. "They broke me open, those Americans, and then they put me back together piece by piece with soap and bread and silly dances on a summer lawn. I went to that camp expecting to die. I left it ready to live. And so the 9 days became more than a number. They became a turning point, a death and a rebirth, a wall torn down and a bridge built in its place. For Margaret Vogel, hunger was the fortress she constructed around her heart, and food was the force that finally broke through the gates. Not because eating was surrender, but because accepting kindness from the enemy meant accepting that the enemy was human too. And once you accept that, everything changes. She kept Private Wilson's photograph for the rest of her life. It sat in a small silver frame on her bedroom dresser, fading slowly over the decades, but never forgotten. She never saw him again, never knew if he returned safely to his farm in Kansas, if he married his high school sweetheart, if he had children of his own who grew up in peace. But every time she looked at that photograph, every time she saw his young smiling face, and the dog named Buster, and the farmhouse porch, she remembered what it felt like to dance in the Louisiana sun, to laugh without fear, to be treated with dignity by people she had been taught to despise. The women who passed through Camp Ruston carried their stories home like seeds in their pockets. They planted them in the rubble of Germany, in the hearts of their children and grandchildren. They whispered the truth that the Reich had tried to bury under mountains of propaganda, that enemies are made, not born, that kindness is a choice that anyone can make, even in the darkest times, that mercy can cut deeper than any sword, and heal wounds that hatred could never touch. As Margaret told her daughter on that long-ago afternoon, her voice thick with the weight of lived experience, "I expected them to break me with cruelty. Instead, they broke me with a feast. They gave me food when I expected poison, soap when I expected filth, dignity when I expected humiliation, and in breaking me, they set me free. That is the story worth remembering, not because it is comfortable, but because it is true. Not because it is simple, but because it shows us what is possible. In the darkest chapter of human history, in the shadow of the worst crimes humanity has ever committed, ordinary people made extraordinary choices. They chose mercy over vengeance. They chose kindness over hatred. They chose to see human beings instead of enemies. And sometimes that is all it takes to change a life forever. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you true stories from World War II that history has forgotten, but humanity needs to remember. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new video. And share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Until next time, remember the past so we can build a better future. Thank you for watching.